on this episode of The Ryan Vet Show.
Everything gets drafted into the culture war. Labels first, humans second. Gen Beta will inherit a world that forbids unity. We need to seek unity, not uniformity. The most countercultural act in the decade ahead may not be what we believe, but whether we can still sit at the same table as those who believe differently. That's Gen Beta's baseline.
And now, a reading from Ryan Vet's newsletter, Collide.
The Romeo and Juliet generation. Why Gen Beta will inherit a world that forbids unity. How parental ideology, algorithmic certainty, and institutional polarization are shaping the most constrained generation yet. Here's to my love, thus with a kiss I die, Romeo laments as he drinks the deadly poison and lays himself to rest next to his true love, Juliet. Shakespeare's story has been retold so many times that we tend to remember the romance and forget the indictment. It isn't just a love story. It's a tragedy of labels overpowering humanity. Two teenagers try to become the authors of their own lives, and the adults around them won't allow it. Not because Romeo is unkind or Juliet is unworthy, but because their world, their parents, their families have already decided their fate based on their last names, Capulet and Montague. Labels first, humans second. And while that ancient tragedy is fiction, I'm not convinced Gen Beta will experience it as fiction. I think Romeo and Juliet are being born right now. Not in Verona, but in suburbs, school districts, church lobbies, subreddits, and group texts where the rules are unspoken but rigid. We don't date people like that, we don't befriend families like that, and we don't trust sources like that. Gen Beta, born 2026 and beyond, won't just inherit polarization, they'll inherit a world where unity is treated like betrayal. The day my car became a political statement and I didn't consent. Before we fast forward into predicting Gen Beta's childhood, I want to show how fast our cultural symbols can flip, because the speed of these flips is part of the problem. A decade ago, after persistent requests, my wife switched her tune from telling me no, I could not buy the new electric smart car, to maybe. I took that maybe as an emphatic yes, so I immediately put a deposit down on a Tesla Model S, knowing it would take the better part of a year before it would be delivered. I did not purchase the car because I was making a statement. I was not trying to be an environmental prophet. I was just a gadget guy. You could have put that smart car tech in any car and I would have likely bought it. When it comes to technology, I'm often an early adopter. The newest smartwatch, smartphone, computer, smart home technology, software, etc. And until Tesla, cars hadn't innovated in a way that felt truly new. To me, it was a fun car, just like my light bulbs that change color by voice command in my home or my smart robot that can both vacuum and mop. Then came the moment that still sticks with me. I pulled into a Tesla supercharger in North Carolina in 2016. It was late fall, close to the presidential election. The charging station was occupied, fully, by a group of large pickup trucks. They were parked horizontally, intentionally blocking access to the chargers. They had flags waving, shotgun racks visible. The message was clear enough. This space isn't for you. What struck me wasn't just the hostility, it was how quickly an object became a proxy for identity. A charging station became a border, a vehicle became a vote. Fast forward less than a decade to the mid-2020s, and the cultural narrative around Tesla and Elon Musk shifted dramatically again. Depending on who you ask, driving a Tesla flipped from a liberal proclamation to a right-leaning statement. Those same individuals who were previously blocking my access to charger flip-flopped and were now cheering on that choice of car. We are talking about a car here. That's the point. When culture is polarized enough, you don't get to own things innocently anymore. Everything gets drafted into the culture war. Now, imagine being a kid trying to figure out who you are when everything you touch is interpreted as a statement. That's Gen Beta's baseline. Gen Beta's inheritance, a world built on extremes. We're living in an age of ideological sorting so intense that it's starting to shape where we live, who we trust, what we teach, and what we forbid. Oh, and what car we drive. This is happening at the exact moment we have more information available than at any other point in human history. We tell ourselves this is the great paradox of our time. Infinite access, infinite perspective. But abundance hasn't produced openness. It produced retreat. For example, trust in the federal government has collapsed from 77% of Americans in the 1960s to roughly 16% today. But it's not just the government that has lost trust. Interpersonal trust has eroded as well. In the early 1970s, nearly half of Americans believed most people could be trusted. Today, that share has fallen roughly to 30 to 34%. This isn't a temporary mood swing. It's a long, steady decline. And when trust collapses, information loses its power. Facts don't persuade in low-trust environments. They ricochet. When conversations become too risky, silence replaces curiosity. That withdrawal doesn't stop at dialogue. It goes deeper than friendship into intimate relationships as well. It is probably no surprise cross-partisan romantic relationships are already rare. Pew Research found that only about 8 or 9% of Democrats and Republicans report having a spouse or long-term partner from the other party. Polarization is no longer just ideological and tied to blue or red, donkey or elephant. It's relational. Belief systems are no longer primarily chosen through exposure and experience. They're absorbed early, reinforced socially, and rarely challenged. This is the soil that Gen Beta will be planted into. Fewer shared spaces, fewer shared stories, fewer relationships that cross what increasingly feels like family lines. In Romeo and Juliet, the family feud is inherited. No one can quite remember how it began. The hatred simply exists. Children didn't choose it. They grew up inside of it. Loyalty is expected before understanding is possible. That's how polarization works too. In a world where trust has collapsed, you must trust something, and increasingly that something is whatever version of truth your family, your algorithm, or your institution hands you first. Gen Beta won't just witness this dynamic, they will be formed by it. The new parenting script: protect them from those people. Every generation tends to overcorrect for the pain it experienced. That's the core hypothesis of the generational pendulum. Gen X overcorrected for largely absent parents, consumed by work, by becoming intensely involved in their kids' lives. Millennials overcorrected for societal instability by seeking safety and meaning. Gen Z, now entering parenting years, is overcorrecting for distrust and extreme emotional fragility. And here's where it gets dicey. When distrust becomes a parenting value, the child doesn't just inherit beliefs, they inherit the boundaries too. It will no longer be parents saying only, don't take candy from that stranger, but it will start to be, don't be friends with that family, or don't go to that school, or don't date that kid because of who their parents voted for. This isn't hypothetical. We're already watching education become a frontline. School boards, once boring, local, and procedural, have become nationalized battlefields. A Fordham Institute study notes how school board politics increasingly mirror broader partisan divides. It says, school board membership is strongly correlated with local partisan voting patterns, suggesting that school governance has become another arena for national political conflict. Harvard's Social Impact Review put it even more bluntly. School boards have become front lines in the culture wars by being pressured, politicized, and increasingly contested spaces. This matters because Gen Beta will grow up watching adults treat institutions like territories to conquer, and kids learn from what adults defend. Institutions are picking sides too. The pressure isn't just on families and schools, it's on brands, CEOs, churches, teams, and employers, because Gen Z expects values to be visible, not private. That belief will most certainly convey, at least in part, to their Gen Beta kids. APCO Worldwide found 88% of Gen Z believe companies should play a role in addressing major societal changes, and 80% believe companies should speak out on social issues that matter to their employees and customers. This is another layer of constraint for Gen Beta. If every institution is expected to declare allegiance, then neutrality becomes suspicious. And when neutrality becomes suspicious, relationships become risky. Because you're not just dating a person anymore, you're dating their parents' politics, their school's policies, their church's postures, their brand's choices, their media ecosystem, and their algorithmic tribe. That's exhausting, and it's a recipe for the kind of forbidden unity Shakespeare wrote about. So what do we do with this? If Gen Beta is the Romeo and Juliet generation, then the question in front of us isn't whether or not polarization exists, but whether we are willing to interrupt its inheritance. Because this isn't a parenting problem alone, it's a leadership problem. The next generation is not being shaped only by what parents say at the dinner table, they're being shaped by how leaders behave in boardrooms, classrooms, churches, companies, platforms, and institutions that increasingly reward certainty over curiosity and allegiance over understanding. Gen Beta has entered the world at a moment when belief is expected to be loud, visible, and defensively held, but conviction on its own is not the danger. The danger is when conviction creates an enemy. So the mandate for leaders is not to abandon belief, but to model a different relationship to it. Here are 3 shifts that matter, especially for those with institutional influence if we don't want to hand Gen Beta a world where unity feels forbidden. First, model conviction without cancellation. Leaders don't need to dilute conviction to allow dialogue. They need to stop treating disagreement as a threat. Unity does not mean sameness, and leadership should not require ideological purity tests. When leaders hold clear beliefs while still creating space for dissent, they show the next generation that conviction and connection are not opposites, and that disagreement does not have to end relationships. As I have often heard it said, we need to seek unity, not uniformity. Second, preserve spaces that are not optimized for agreement. Organizations and even brands, including cars, are becoming increasingly efficient at sorting people by values, beliefs, and ideology. But human development requires shared spaces that are not curated for sameness. Algorithms cannot do this work. Institutions must. If leaders do not intentionally protect cross-cutting spaces, they will quietly disappear. Third, make disagreement survivable. When disagreement is treated as a danger, people retreat. When it's treated as disloyalty, relationships fracture. But when leaders remove contempt from conflict, when they demonstrate their conviction does not require cancellation, they make it possible for unity to exist without uniformity. Romeo and Juliet didn't just die because love was weak. To the contrary, it was strong love that led to their demise. They died because the world around them made love illegal. Gen Beta is arriving in a world that risks repeating the same mistake, only now the family names aren't Capulet and Montague. They are ideological, institutional, and algorithmic. They're reinforced not by swords and poison, but by silence, sorting, and certainty. This generation does not need leaders who erase differences. They need leaders who refuse to turn differences into the enemy. Because the most countercultural act in the decade ahead may not be what we believe, but whether we can still sit at the same table as those who believe differently. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Ryan.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ryan Vet Show. Be sure to subscribe, comment, and like this episode. Plus, share it with someone who needs to hear it.